I'm Nigel van der Linden. This is Collaboration is Culture podcast, exploring how we work together and how to make it better. In this episode, I'm joined by Josh Hammonds. With 15 years of experience in interpersonal and business communication, Josh conducts research and develops corporate leaders and their teams. As a business communication professor, Josh teaches courses such as leadership, conflict negotiation, and organizational communication at Rollins College and has presented original research and conducted workshops at various institutions. Josh's consulting work includes communication, intervention, and data analytics solutions. Josh believes communication and relationships are crucial to social and professional success. Josh, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Nigel. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Josh, I was inspired to contact you after reading your LinkedIn posts about stress from back-to-back meetings. Can you tell the listeners a bit about this post?
Yes, the Microsoft study. This is fascinating because the study was published in 2021, so a few years ago. Microsoft internally did a study where they wanted to look at how much stress is the human, and particularly the brain, producing when we have these sort of back-to-back Zoom meetings. And at the time, the study was grounded in the context of Zoom meetings. But they took two groups of individuals. It's a small sample size, and that's one of the critiques of the study. But they looked at two different groups, and they said, what would happen if we had a group of individuals take four meetings, back to back without breaking at all, and then another group comes in and we just have somewhere between a 5 and a 10 minute rest, a reset. And what fascinated me is that the individuals who did not break in between the meetings, which is oftentimes what we see, I've experienced it as well, is that there was a compounding effect of beta waves in the brain. Now, beta waves are produced anytime that the brain is focused on something that could be stressful. So oftentimes in an experiment, we'll have an individual do maybe a complicated math problem, or there could be like an impromptu speech in front of strangers, and that's the kind of stress that the brain produces, these beta waves. And what they found was that if there was no break in between the meetings, by meeting 3, the stress was so large that the EEG cap showed lots of red and beta wave production. But the group that had just even a 10-minute reset in between the meetings just allowed sort of the brain to calm, to center, to allow sort of wandering thoughts about the prior meeting to just rest a little bit, just to create some closure about the past meeting before we start the next meeting. And that just fascinated to me because I as a communication scholar, we talk about this idea of disclosure and closing the loop with your brain. And sometimes you need to communicate things out loud. Well, if you haven't finished the narrative, if you haven't finished what you were talking about before, and then you immediately start a new meeting or a new conversation, your brain's not done processing what just happened. And so if we're doing back-to-back meetings without really clean closure, with a rest period, the brain cannot take that kind of rumination and that kind of stress. And so to me, I just thought it was a great, clear, simple evidence for why it is imperative that we just have these breaks in between what we do, that let the brain rest. And I think we have this culture of let's just power through. We got another hour, one more meeting. Let's just get through it and then we can rest. And I'm going, that's fine. But then that last meeting, those last 4 meetings of the day, no one's creative. No one's thinking clearly. Everybody is burned out, mentally for that effect. So I thought it was worth sharing. I had no idea it would get the kind of clout and exposure that it did, especially with it being a few years old. But it's still very applicable and very relevant today. I think companies really need to respond to this.
Well, to put it lightly, you struck a chord with that post. Tell me about the response you received.
So lots of response. I had no idea 6 million people would view this post. I did not realize that 50,000 would engage in it in some way. Either like it, love it, and then 20,000 people shared it. And to me, those stats right there says that at some point, not only did that resonate, but the fact that you had about 20,000 people sharing it and tagging certain people. I don't know who they were tagging, but they might have been leaders in companies. But that kind of response showed me that this is something we're all feeling, and now there's some clear evidence as to why we can have policy change. And so I probably got a few hundred direct messages from screenshots from people's Slack threads saying, look, this is great evidence. This is something we've talked about for a long time. From now on, new company policy, we are breaking in between meetings. This needs to happen. And so that, to me, to see that kind of effect, that it's a low-hanging fruit change, but it's part of this change towards, let's create a policy in which mental health and mental restoration is part of the guiding principles.
So what conclusions or takeaways did you draw from that response, that overwhelming response?
Yeah, I think the conclusion is that, I think a couple different things. Number one, we are experiencing a meeting epidemic that in the last few years has only been accelerated by COVID. You know, if you look at the data, 50 years ago, the average executive was in 10 hours worth of meetings a week. And then right before the pandemic, you're talking about somewhere between 23 and 25 hours of meetings per week. So we see a doubling happen in the last 50 years. But then when the pandemic hit, I think somewhere between 13 and 15% more of our day is spent in meetings. And so we have gotten into this rut that meetings are the answer. If we can't account for you, if we don't know exactly what you're doing at home, but we fervently believe in productivity, as you should in an organization, the best solution is let's just schedule back-to-backs all day long. At least then we know that they're having conversations and they're talking and they're planning and executing. But is that true, right? And so are we in fact being productive when we're in meetings back-to-back? So the first takeaway was we are overdoing it on the meetings. The second one is that we really do have a burnout problem, a burnout issue. And I think sometimes we think, well, I'm sitting in a chair, it's air conditioned, I'm not shoveling, I'm not doing manual labor necessarily. Mm-hmm. So what's the point? Let's just make our day, in meetings, and we're forgetting that the brain is also like a muscle, gets worn out, gets tired, and that also needs to rest. Any way that you would have a manual labor saying, I need to take a break, I no longer can physically do this job, your brain should also take that break. And so we're reaching a place of cognitive burnout, and we need that rest. So meeting pandemic is happening, and then also we're having a burnout pandemic. And if we don't reconcile this, we're going to have to make some major changes.
How did we get here? How did we arrive at this place that meetings seem to be, the only way right. that collaboration happens in an organization? Right.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. I've been thinking about that a lot, not only before the post, but since the post. And I think that, and I'll choose my words carefully, but Industrial Revolution, much of our work and much of our labor was on the clock, and it was timed. And so you did a job that was based on what the factory could produce. And so efficiency and productivity were a big part of the driving force, and you needed a human being in that space so that you could predict the exact output that factory would make and what kind of product and materials were happening. We still have those jobs, but a large portion of some of the jobs, especially the ones on LinkedIn that were sharing my post, academics call this sort of knowledge work. And this is the idea that you're not being paid so much by the specific product that you're producing, but the knowledge that you have about something. And so it is based on brainstorming and collaboration and coming up with new ideas and putting those together. And you're not always producing all of the time. And so I think leaders and organizations are asking themselves, okay, how do we account for what you're doing, and how do we make your job more accountable? And so we just assume that we should put individuals in meetings back to back in order to collaborate. But I don't know about you, but sometimes my best ideas are certainly not in meetings, but they are 2 hours after the meeting, and I'm going for a run, and I think of this new idea, and then tomorrow morning I come back and say, okay, I think I've got it. Let's work on this. And I don't know if everybody is ready to face the fact that sometimes collaboration needs to happen asynchronously just as much as synchronously. And so it's great to meet. Let's establish a framework. Let's establish some project deadlines, and let's talk about some things and brainstorm, and then let's go away for a few days. And then let's come back and see if new ideas were percolating. The brain can't just produce creativity and it cannot just innovate in the moment just because this is when the meeting is happening, right? And so allow ideas to percolate, maybe we separate for a little bit and then come back. And when I mention that to leaders, they say, okay, but what about accountability? How do we know if they're working? How do we know if they've finished a milestone on a collaborative project? And I think that we have to get better at becoming more results-oriented type of goal tracking. That I think for years we've said, if you're on the meeting and you're in a Zoom and you've worked for 8 hours in meetings, then that's 8 hours of work. But what would it look like to say, okay, it might take 20 to 30 hours to finish this project. It might take me a week or 2 weeks. Let's identify what the finished goal of that project looks like. We'll put it out there, and then we'll track away each day when we look at that and when we see that. And so tracking goals, I think, needs to change in organizations. And we need to realize that when the project is finished, we can track that, not just because I've been in a meeting with somebody synchronously.
In one of your posts, you use the term meeting culture. Can you tell me what does that mean? What is meeting culture?
I think for an organization to really establish what a good and healthy meeting culture is, you've got to look at some of the research and some of the data. So, in other words, what really drives somebody to be collaborative, to engage with individuals? And there's one study in particular that they did several years ago where they wanted to find out what makes a meeting something that is engaging and satisfactory, and then what really drains people in meetings. And so there's several things you can do in a meeting. And so we certainly have a little bit of info sharing and status updates, but then we also have brainstorming and strategy, where we're thinking of new ideas, we're innovating, we're generating new ideas, we're building off existing ideas. And then the last part is execution or action planning. And so if you think about those three elements, information sharing, strategy, and execution, I think a lot of times meeting culture sadly errs on the side of information sharing. That they assume that because we're having meetings, we need to tell everybody everything because we have an undivided audience. And I think that if we can get into a habit of when we hold these meetings, because time is precious, time is money. When we hold these meetings, what are the things in a meeting that we should be doing that would be productive, that would be engaging and satisfactory to the employees? That really is only two things. That's strategy and execution. And so if our meeting culture could shift a little bit, that everybody has the information that they need before the meeting starts. Send out the agenda. Give the status updates well before the meeting starts. Then we can come to the meeting. It can be a lot more productive, and we can engage in idea generation, brainstorming, strategy, right? And then also execution. And what's the action plan here? How do we delegate this? How do we figure out who owns it? What's the timeline behind each of these projects? That, to me, is a meeting culture where everybody says, okay, we got something out of it. It felt fulfilling, it felt good, and we can move on. But I think so many organizations have sadly fallen into this idea that meetings are all about just telling everybody information. And I think we have other ways to send out information if, in fact, it is a one-way communication channel, right?
Where's the place for relationship building or connection? And I think about that especially in the context of remote and hybrid work, where we have potentially less interaction with our teammates, bosses, etc. Is that potentially one of the purposes for or a reason to have a meeting?
Absolutely. And I love that you bring this up because lots of companies have gone back to the office. Some are still fully remote. And one of the things that we're seeing right now is that in fully remote or hybrid organizations, you've got to continue meeting with your teams, and a good chunk of the meeting, the first 10 minutes of the meeting, we do save that for human connection. How are you doing? Going beyond fine. Because we're missing out on a lot of the water cooler moments where we can connect in the hallways, pop into a conference room to see how people are doing. And so what you're seeing right now is that the organizations that are fully remote, that are thriving still, that will tell you, I still love the culture at this organization, they're almost creating a hyper culture within their teams. And so what you're finding is that these individuals are actually meeting a little bit more often than they were before. They were face to face, but they're meeting with other departments and other divisions within the organization less frequently. And so they're creating what you would consider a hyperculture or a closer culture within their team, because they have to do all the strategy and execution. And so the principle I always say with this is that the first 5-10 minutes of your meeting, if you're a fully remote organization, you do want to spend that time connecting with people, going around, right? Scale of 1 to 10, how's everybody's week? Maybe give us a number, maybe give us one thing that's been on your plate so that we can hear from each other, we can empathize with each other, right? And then we go right into strategy, execution that follows the agenda of what we should be talking about during that meeting.
Meetings are often so jam-packed, Josh. How do we make room for connection and relationship?
I think two ways. You need an agenda, and then you need a mediator who holds you to that agenda. And so having an agenda says, here is the roadmap for this meeting. We're going to do 5 to 10 minutes of connecting. Then we're going to do 5 minutes of status updates. No more than 5 minutes. They need to be summaries. They need to be concise. And then if we're going to do a strategy session, maybe that's 20 minutes. Maybe that's longer. Maybe we've already done some of the strategy session, and this meeting is all about executing. And so you have parameters around the times of which that happens, and then designate somebody to hold the time. Have a moderator who says, okay, I love where this is going. For the sake of time, we're going to move on to this. And then what I oftentimes say is, maybe there's one person in the meeting that loves being that person. Sometimes that can be difficult to always be the time bearer and say, stop talking, we're moving on. And so sometimes even having that being a rotating position can be healthy for a team. But if you have that agenda ironed out, that tells me that the leaders and those who are designated to talk or own a part of the meeting have thought about it. They've mapped out what they want to say, and they know how long they have to say it. So that even a minor rehearsal before the meeting happens, where they go over their notes, so that you can prevent individuals from going way too long or oversharing. Because that's oftentimes what we find. When you say a meeting's too jam-packed or there was too much in there, chances are a few people overshared and went longer than they had thought about.
Are the leaders you speak of, or their organizations, are they ready to tackle the meeting culture problem?
Oh, wow. Behavioral change is hard. Behavioral change is hard. And so what that means is that low-hanging fruit decisions have to be made. And so what does it look like to have a science-backed policy change? So something as simple as saying 10-minute breaks, I think, again, another reason why this went so viral, okay, that's easy to do. We can change that behavior. We can set our Outlook. We can set our Zoom to 50 minutes instead of 60 minutes. We all can do that. Great. And then I think the next change that needs to happen is probably either a technological supplement where you have a dashboard that says, here's the agenda, here's the template for the agenda, make sure this is filled out and sent out before the meeting begins. And so I do think technology and certain products will come into this space to help change the behavior. But if you've been for 10 years doing 6 to 8 hours of meetings back to back for the past couple of years, at your position, that's going to be difficult to just change overnight. And so I'd be interested to see how Microsoft Teams might roll out something, right? So, you've got a template that everybody can use, or you've got designated moderator in the Zoom window, and this person has a timer and things like this. So as technology catches up to this idea of mental health, that this needs to get better, I think that will help change the behavior of our meeting culture.
Now, I'm certainly aware of examples of organizations instituting meeting-free days, so a meeting-free Wednesday or meeting-free weeks, as the case may be. Slack, as an example, introduced Maker Weeks, where 2 times a quarter they eliminate most meetings. Can you perhaps share any learnings from your consulting practice of organizations implementing, let's say, tactics or strategies to, in fact, reduce the number of meetings and what some of the outcomes have been?
Absolutely. So, and I think this works as long as it's an organizational policy. And I worked for a company that had no meetings on Thursdays. And so it was very strong. We held to that. There were blockouts. It gets tricky when you've got a customer or a client that needs to meet. So does that count, right? And so, but at least you can remove the organizational meetings that can happen. I think that works really well. But again, it needs to be consistent, needs to be talked about, probably needs to be presented from the top down so that we understand this. And then leaders need to follow, right? There's this idea of modeling behavior. So if a leader says no meetings on Thursday, but they're doing all these meetings on Thursday, or they're meeting with each other, what does that send? And so
secret meeting Thursdays.
Secret meeting. Actions speak louder than words. I think it can help. I also think that there should be a checklist, right? I'm in the process of even building this right now, but should this be a meeting? Yes or no? And you've got a checklist where you say, have the status updates been shared, right? Is this going to be a brainstorming strategy session that you need all hands in this department? Great. Will there be some sort of action planning that happens at the end of it? And if so, what is it? Great. Yes. And so if you can tick enough boxes, then this should be a meeting. If not, you might be able to do this offline. And so we've come a long way with live asynchronous documents. I've worked on projects before in 4 different time zones for large clients, and everybody puts in their input, tags the person to remind them what they've done. I'll throw a quick video on there explaining what I've done in 2 minutes because I'm very non-verbally centric. I love to give my non-verbal communication messages to my team so they can catch kind of the conviction or the passion I might have for a project. But so much can be done asynchronously, and organizations that have teams that are distributed across time zones, they have figured this out and they're doing it well. And I think we just need to spotlight some of the strategies that they're using for other organizations so that we can say, wow, we actually can do this. We didn't know Zoom existed till the pandemic. We've had Skype for years. Poor Skype gets left out during the pandemic. That's another conversation. But we've had Skype for years, and all of a sudden, I guess we can Zoom. We do know what this is, and we can use it. So I think it's just the awareness of what some other companies are doing and putting that into the mainstream will be hugely advantageous.
I think there's an acknowledgement that this requires organizational change or culture change. And so often that comes top down. For the individual, the IC, the individual contributor that might be listening to this, what is within the span of their control? What can they do, right, to mitigate that scenario that your LinkedIn post described, meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting.
Right. Yeah. And as I think back, that's probably a good chunk of the 20,000 shares that were tagging people was the individual contributor saying, see, we're dying out here. We're dying. You can't keep doing this to us, And so I think that's some of the things that they can do as, especially if it's a science-backed study like this. We've got a phrase right now that's going around LinkedIn: "No agenda, no atenda," and it's kind of it's a jovial way of saying, "Hey, hey, I didn't get an agenda. Does that mean I have to attend?" And sort of chuckle about it. But these are all sort of moves towards to nudge individuals to say, "Hey, let's structure this a little bit better. Let's think twice before we just fall into this rut." And so I think people are sharing this kind of information that I'm putting out there, and so many others are putting out there on meeting culture and the damaging effects of it, right? That it's doing mentally, but also 68% of the people that are in meetings, 68% of them believe that meetings are actually blockers to the productivity that they have with their actual work. So meetings, 68% of the people that are in meetings are thinking to themselves, this is actually preventing me from doing my job. Right. Not that I don't want to be here, but I need to also do my job.
In some of the research I conducted leading up to this, I spoke with some of the commentators to your post, and many described meetings as you just have as interrupting, and now I'm using their words, their real work.
Yeah.
And so their work day and their most productive hours were consumed in meetings, and their real work was then pushed to the margins of the workday. So they're starting earlier and they're finishing later. I wonder if that came up in any of the private comments that or the DMs that you received.
Oh, certainly. There were lots of people saying that, I'm sitting in this meeting. One individual had direct messaged me, so much of my work is just listening to people share about their work and what's going on in the company that doesn't have necessarily anything to do with my work, and it's preventing me from doing that, which is why 30-40% of the people that are in meetings are multitasking, because they are,
right.
Oh, I've got 6 emails to get to, I've got this project, but I get it that you want to tell me this thing, this status update. Your information sharing, which isn't completely relevant to my work, right? And again, I don't want to live in a siloed world. I do think info sharing is important. Status updates are important, but are we delivering them in the best way that we can? And so I think thinking wisely about who needs to be in the meeting and how much does this person need to know? Because the person delivering the information is very passionate about it. This is something that they've been working on for a long time. They've got lots of thoughts about it, and I'm guessing that a lot of the thoughts aren't really landed, which is why they're oversharing and verbally processing. But for an individual to take up space in a meeting, asking themselves, does everybody here who's receiving this information need this much information? Because they are also working on a full plate, and this meeting could be potentially blocking them from doing actual work. Because I would like to talk it out, because it gives me clarity to talk about it, right? Mm-hmm. And so again, I'm just a huge fan of the video message. And if I've got some kind of status update or information that I need to share, I keep it as concise as possible, 3 minutes or less. And then I send the team, and it's waiting for them to watch and absorb that information when they do have a break, when they are in between 2 projects, and they can absorb that then.
Josh, you said that one of the reasons this post went viral is that you offered, a really simple and easily implementable solution, which was introducing breaks between meetings. And I think in an earlier conversation with me, you described, that's the first step in chipping away at the iceberg. What might that second or third step be?
Yeah, so if we're breaking in between meetings, is the first step. I think the second step is, does this need to be a meeting? And so having a checklist of some sort that says, okay, does everybody need to stop what they're doing right now, come to this Zoom room or Microsoft Team room and do this? And so creating an organizational checklist that says how much of this meeting could have been delivered offline. And so the low-hanging fruit for that is any kind of status update or information sharing that's happening should and could be delivered asynchronously well before the meeting starts. So we can now remove that from the meeting. Is there anything left now? Was it just information sharing? Right? One of the jokes I always say is, if you need my ears, send me a message, or I'm sorry, if you need my ears or my eyes, send me a message or send me an email. If you need my mouth, if you need feedback, then maybe we can pull in and do a meeting. So it's an idea of, is this a one-way message? Mm-hmm. Because I have lack of trust in my people, I'm going to pull them all together so that I have a completely sort of captivated audience. Or is this something that I genuinely want immediate feedback on, that we could create some kind of strategy session where we're whiteboarding or, putting in comments in the chat to come up with some new ideas. If that's the case, if it's a dialogue, let's bring everybody in. But I just don't know how many meetings are truly that sort of strategy session, delegating, action planning, right?
And then the third?
I think the third strategy is no agenda, no attenda. Because it does. If Blaise Pascal said, if I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. And I think it's this idea that in the moment, my words are long. My meeting is going to be longer if I don't have a lot of time. But if I can just put some thought and planning into it, watch how much I can cut off the information that I need to share, or what I think is extremely important actually maybe wasn't as important as I think about that and resonate with that, and create a more condensed, concise reason to meet. So an agenda sort of forces us to think about it in preparation. And in doing so, I think we're saving a lot more time.
So Josh, tell me, why are meetings the default? Why do meetings seem to be, if not the only way, certainly the preferred way that we work together?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and the way I can answer that is I was working with a very large organization about a month ago, and they were debating on whether or not they needed to change their return to office policy. And I said, okay, let's unpack this. What are some reasons that are guiding this uncertainty behind this? Why do you want to do this? Well, I said, it seems like everybody's coming back to the office, and I think we should probably have some kind of policy that does that. And I said, absolutely. Let's definitely create a policy about whether or not we are coming back to the office or not coming back to the office. Let's look at rules about hybrid versus remote. You certainly should have that. But what is driving this sort of uncertainty about why you aren't even sure about whether you want to drive this in, drive people back into the office? And they said, we just... since everyone's doing it, we're just uncertain if this is something we should do. And I said, well, is there a revenue problem? No, not a revenue problem at all. Revenue is coming in. The products are great. I said, okay, do you have an attrition problem? Are you losing people? No, we're getting some of the best that want remote jobs. I said, okay, where's the fire? And they said, well, I think the biggest thing that we talk about is accountability. And are our people doing what they say they're supposed to be doing? We can't see them. And I said, okay, so you're not sure if you can trust that your people are putting it out. And they, and I think that's a sensitive issue. Do we trust our people? And so to unpack that, is this what's driving some of the meeting culture, that I'm not really sure what you're doing? Well, if they're doing the job and the revenue is good and they're hitting their deadlines, if they work into the middle of the night but then take a couple of hours off in the day, is that the worst thing? Well, I think we need to be accountable, and so maybe we should bring people to the office, or at the very least schedule back-to-back meetings. And so I think sometimes this default is, I'm not sure what you're doing. So if somebody can account for you that you're in a Zoom window or a Microsoft Team window, then that means that you're at the very least doing something or being productive in some way. And I just think we have it backwards. And I think that if we could learn to trust, and I think trust is reciprocal, that we want our people to trust us and trust them. I think we've got to show them trust, and then I think they will show us trust. One of the biggest drivers of employee engagement is this idea of autonomy. And autonomy basically means, look, here's the deal. You've hired me to do a job. I certainly hope that you have expectations of what that job should look like. We certainly have deadlines. We certainly have, we're marking our goals here. But at the same time, if you give me the autonomy to be able to do this job in the time frame that I want, in the location that I want, right? And in some ways in the way that I want, and the output is still excellent, right? That gives somebody a huge incentive to say, I'm engaged here. I love this job. I love that kind of freedom I have to do the job in the best way that I see fit, right? You've hired somebody with experience. Let me put all of my experience into this task, and let me do it in the best way that I see fit. And so that autonomy, which I think is highly, highly correlated with trust, is, I think, two of the biggest drivers of engagement. And it's something that I think executives or leaders are going, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I'm ready to trust everybody. And I think that lack of trust is what's leading to the back-to-back meetings, right? At least there's a camera on you. And so we could unpack that at a different time, but that gets into Big Brother and make sure everyone's watching you and all that sort of stuff too.
Well, if maybe we abstract somewhat from whether it's remote, which means obviously there's a camera, or you're in person, there's an assumption being made that meeting or meeting attendance equals output or productivity, right? Barring some actual measure of output or achievement, the proxy is butts and seats. I can see you, you're in a meeting, you're in front of me, maybe you're contributing, but that's the standard for which productivity is applied.
Yeah. An individual doesn't always work exactly consistently in the same way. That oftentimes some of our best work is punctuated. And so I think that, maybe it's an athlete that's running consistently, but maybe needs to walk for a mile, and then when they start running again, they're faster than they were before they stopped walking, that there's these punctuated moments, that maybe a 20-hour power nap at noon after that, going back to those brain scans, refresh your brain so much that the next 3 hours are far more creative and far more productive. And we have to realize that just because decades ago we decided that 8 to 5 was when the human being was going to work and that's when they're the most productive, that is not always the case. And so there are oftentimes moments where I will need a 30-minute walk, and I will walk out of my office and I will go walk for 30 minutes and come back, and the new ideas that I have and the new energy that I have is so much stronger. So we've got to get out of this mindset shift that just because you're working during these times, right? We've hired someone full time, and that means I've purchased all of your time, and I'm paying you for all of your time, and that means 8 to 5, and so that's what I expect. That's just not how biology works. It isn't.
Your comment about, I'm buying all of your time also reminds me of the conversation that we had last week or a week and a half ago. And I can't remember who put it forward, but there was sort of a hypothesis that meetings are perceived as a sunk cost, right? Or the cost isn't considered at all because, especially in the context of salaried employees, right? It's already bought and paid for. I've bought all of your time.
Right.
And so, therefore, you can and will sit in these meetings.
Right.
I actually saw a LinkedIn post just last week with something to the effect of, and I may not get this exactly right, business owners ask me for 15 minutes. Salaried employees ask me for an hour.
Wow. That's exactly right. One of my best friends is a lawyer. He charges in 6-minute increments. And I think if we saw the calculator of how much we are spending at 6-minute chunks, right, in meetings, I think we would think twice about, is this the best use of our time and resources?
I actually responded to that LinkedIn post and made the suggestion that we post the cost of the meeting live in somewhat the same vein as the national debt calculator. I don't know if you've ever been to that website, but I mean, it's going up by the hundreds of millions every second. I think that might cause, one, a bit of a chuckle, but at least some pause or some recognition that there is a real cost. There is a direct cost in terms of the salaried employees around the table, as well as the opportunity cost, right? Because they're here, what else aren't they working on?
Right. Everything you say yes to in a meeting, you're saying no to something else, that gets shortchanged. And so now this creative project that you're paying me big for, with all of my experience and my brain is going into this project, you're getting the leftovers from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. that I've got to squeeze in there because my prime cognitive real estate was taken up by listening to status updates.
Went into this meeting. Oh, that is so true. Right? It's, the meat and potatoes of the work is being shortchanged. Because all of the available energy, cognitive or otherwise, is going into the meetings of the workday.
And wasn't that Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg with their capsule wardrobes, right? Isn't that why they do this? So
that's right.
That from the time they wake up until their first meeting at 9:30 or 10, they make 0 decisions.
Yes.
They put on the same outfit, eat the same breakfast, have the same route to the office, so that nothing is expended. That if I have a reservoir of cognitive energy, I don't touch it until that first meeting, and then these are the biggest decisions that my company has to make, those first 2 or 3 meetings, because I know that's the first fruits. That's the greatest part that my brain, greatest point in which my brain is working.
You prompted another thought. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of load management, but it's a sports analogy. And I think used first in basketball. And so now a lot of coaches will rest their players under the guise of load management so that they're ready for the key games or for the playoffs, for that matter, so they can make a deep run into the playoffs. And what I hear you describing in different words is, in effect, some form of of load management, right? Cognitive load management, energy, emotional, etc. If all of the energy is expended in meetings, there's nothing left for the most important work. In other words, there's no load management happening.
Right. Absolutely.
What's the role of a manager, right? Just if we take the concept of a coach, right? Making sure his players are rested so they can make a deep playoff run. Like, what's the role of a manager in terms of implementing or mitigating the load on their staff?
I think it's good. And my philosophy on management is know your people. Right. And so I think a good manager will know what drains their employees and what will make their employees thrive and energized. And so again, I'm not saying no meetings ever. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a meeting, and maybe it's 2 hours, but we are brainstorming and we are coming up with a new idea, maybe for a new product, a new way to look at it. And there's humor and new ideas, and here's what I've done, and oh, that sounds fantastic. What if we applied this? And so there are those moments where there's a 2-hour synergy brainstorming sessions, and you leave, and you might be tired, right? You're like, okay, nothing more for the rest of the day. But you know, to use your analogy, you left it all on the field there. You went into that, and you were thrived. You were energized. The next day, you're still thinking about that meeting because it was so life-giving. And so if my manager knew that about me, they would say, okay, we're going to save the strategy sessions for Josh. He loves those, right? And then other things where you go, oh, I just sat there and listened to X, Y, and Z. This is not my wheelhouse. This is not anything that is applicable or relevant to what I do. Why was I even in this meeting? Did I accidentally get invited to this, right? A manager needs to know who the individuals that need to be in on that session and what the activity in that meeting is. And so I think a good manager will save their people from energy draining activities and energy draining meetings.
And just to sort of underscore what you said earlier about the purpose of meetings. In other words, when we should use a meeting. I heard you say strategy, which I also heard you describe as sort of brainstorming or problem solving, and then building an action plan. So bringing a solution together, and then connection or relationship.
Absolutely.
Do I have that right?
Yeah, so these are the three. Yeah, so connection works. If you see each other often throughout the day and you have those moments, you may not need an elongated connection. But if you are remote or hybrid, you've got to have 5 to 10 minutes of connecting if you've got a weekly meeting or a bi-weekly meeting where you're empathizing and hearing the humanness of each other. That just needs to happen. So connection does need to happen. But strategy is interesting. Strategy can look like a lot of different things. I think the first thing with strategy, anytime you're strategizing in a meeting, is idea generation. And so we come to the table with, these are all new ideas on how to correct this problem or how to pivot or how to build something new. So what's fascinating is idea generation oftentimes doesn't happen synchronously. And so what I will do is say, all right, next meeting is going to be about this. Here's the new thing we want to do. Here's our problem. Everybody come with 10 new ideas. And so the idea generation, you can't really predict. These are punctuated moments where, like I said, you're going for a run or going for a walk and you get these new ideas. So everybody comes maybe with a few ideas. And then there are several things that can happen in strategy. So you can take those ideas and you can extend them to new context. The other thing you can do is you can take these ideas and figure out new applications for those ideas. And then the third thing you can do is you can combine other people's ideas. Ooh, I love that idea and I love that idea. What if we did those things together? And so combination, application, and extension of ideas are all part of that strategy session. And I do think if that happens in a meeting and there's good energy, it's a great meeting. Everybody walks away going, that was good. And then execution is that last one. And so saving enough time, and I have to watch myself because I've been in a meeting where the whole meeting is a strategy session and there was no final execution. And that's okay in some moments, especially if you feel like you're not done strategizing. And so you sort of put a pin in it, synthesize it. Here's where we're at right now. We will pick up and then we'll execute next week. That can happen, but if you are going to execute in that meeting, making sure there's a good 15 minutes at the end to say, okay, now let's synthesize what we've talked about. This is the execution. Synthesize what we talked about. Delegate ownership. who's going to take what, and then put a timeline together. And I think what people oftentimes miss sometimes in meetings is we have these assumptions that everybody is going to do what they say that they're going to do. There's these expectations. And I think we need to change the language and talk about agreements versus expectations. Yeah, we're connecting, we're strategizing, which could look very different depending on the group. And then finally, we're executing.